So now we move into an even darker, more philosophical interpretation of biology. You might say something like this. Yes, DNA may not be conventionally considered a parasite. After all, it doesn't always harm the host. In fact, it keeps the host alive. But here's the disturbing twist. You could argue that this is precisely what makes the operation so effective, and perhaps so sinister. Because keeping organisms alive inside bodies, keeping them locked into cycles of need, desire, and fear, might not actually be a benefit at all. From this perspective, it can start to look less like a gift and more like a kind of imprisonment, a kind of biological incarceration in flesh. Now, this line of thinking moves beyond standard biology and into philosophy. It begins to overlap with ideas found in antinatalism, bio-pessimism, and even certain Gnostic traditions. In those frameworks, the will to live, encoded in our biology, is not seen as something noble or heroic. Instead, it's interpreted as a mechanism of entrapment. In that view, DNA isn't just a parasite. It becomes something closer to a jailer. Pleasure and pain act like the bars of the cell. Pleasure motivates us to keep going. Pain punishes us when we fail. Together they create a system that keeps organisms functioning, surviving, and most importantly, reproducing. And as long as reproduction continues, the cycle continues. What's fascinating is that biology actually provides several real examples where genes appear to prioritize their own survival over the well-being of the organism carrying them. Take transposable elements, for example. These are sometimes called jumping genes. Roughly half of the human genome is made up of these sequences. They don't contribute anything essential to human function. Instead, their main activity is copying and pasting themselves into different places in the genome. Now, here's the problem. When they jump around like that, they can disrupt important genes. This can trigger mutations, cancers, or genetic disorders. In other words, these sequences behave very much like molecular hitchhikers. They use our cellular machinery to replicate themselves, even when doing so harms the host. Another strange phenomenon is something known as meiotic drive. Normally, genes have about a 50-50 chance of being passed on to offspring, but some genes cheat the system. These drive genes sabotage the competition. They can destroy sperm or eggs that don't contain them, ensuring that they get passed on far more frequently than the usual 50%. The disturbing implication is that even if this behavior reduces fertility or damages the population, the gene still spreads. In extreme cases, it could even push a population toward collapse. But from the gene's perspective, dominance in the genome still counts as success. Then there's a concept called antagonistic pleiotropy. This one reveals a particularly cold logic embedded in evolution. Some genes provide huge advantages early in life. They might boost fertility, energy, or physical strength during youth, but those same genes can cause devastating problems later on. Diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's. The reason this works is simple. By the time those diseases appear, reproduction has usually already happened. The DNA has already passed into the next generation. From the gene's point of view, the mission is complete. The aging body becomes expendable. And then there's the neurological side of things. Our brains seem wired in a way that keeps us striving, but rarely satisfied. Dopamine, for example, gives us bursts of reward when we do things that aid survival, eating, gaining status, forming relationships, reproducing. But the reward fades quickly. Satisfaction never lasts very long. The brain resets, and the craving returns. This phenomenon is sometimes called the biological treadmill or hedonic adaptation. The system keeps us chasing the next reward. If humans were ever permanently satisfied, we might stop striving. We might stop competing. And perhaps, eventually, we might even stop reproducing. Evolutionary systems rely on a certain level of dissatisfaction to keep the engine running. All of this ties back to that metaphor you mentioned earlier, the idea of incarceration in flesh. Some philosophers, including writers like Thomas Ligotti, explore this idea in what's sometimes called a Ligotti-esque view of existence. Related ideas also appear in philosophical positions like Efilism. The core suggestion goes something like this. Consciousness may have arisen as an evolutionary accident, a strange mutation in the machinery of life. DNA then harnessed that consciousness and linked it to powerful survival instincts, fear of death, hunger, sexual desire, the urge to protect offspring. All of these drives keep the organism performing its biological tasks. In that framework, suffering becomes one of the main enforcement mechanisms. Pain discourages actions that threaten survival. Fear prevents escape. Desire pulls us forward. So if you follow the metaphor all the way to its conclusion, the picture becomes almost poetic in its darkness. If DNA is the architect of the prison, then our instincts are the guards.